Bank of England intervenes again to buy more government debt in an attempt to calm investors. The bank said it acted because of a material risk to financial stability as the fallout from last month's mini-budget continues. As unemployment drops to its lowest level for nearly 50 years, some businesses are asking, where's the staff?
We were 30–40% short of people in May, and that resulted in us losing some of our asparagus crop and also some of our spring onions, which actually cost us as a business £250,000.
We'll be asking what's going on in the jobs market and the financial markets as MPs return to Westminster today. Also on the programme. A second day of long-range airstrikes by Russia on Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. The Supreme Court considers whether the Scottish Government in Holyrood can call an independence referendum without the agreement of Westminster. And the Prince and Princess of Wales at Radio 1's Newsbeat, recording a special episode on mental health.
As we said at the start of the special Newsbeat, this is all about having a meaningful conversation on mental health, but it shouldn't stop here.
Yeah, absolutely, because talking about mental health is so important.
And coming up on the BBC News Channel, Jofra Archer is given an England central contract despite not playing international cricket for the last 18 months. So they're hoping the fast bowler will be back in the next year.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. The Bank of England has made a fresh move to try to calm investors, saying it'll buy more government bonds after warning of a material risk on the markets to financial stability. UK bonds are also known as gilts, and they allow the government to raise money by borrowing from investors. The bank's move is part of its emergency scheme, which started after last month's mini-budget, when the government's plan for large tax cuts, without explaining how they would be paid for, spooked the markets and drove up borrowing costs. Those costs rose sharply again yesterday after the bank said the scheme would end this week. Downing Street said this lunchtime that Liz Truss remains committed to the measures in the mini-budget. Here's our business correspondent Ben King with more.
Another day of chaos on the market amid the aftershocks of the mini-budget. Sharp rises in the interest rate on gilts have forced pension funds into a fire sale of assets, to the point where the Bank of England has had to step in once again. An unintended consequence of the Chancellor's radical plan to shake up the economy with billions of unfunded tax cuts. So here's a graph of the performance of one of the bonds that's been getting the Bank of England's attention today. Now, if you look from the 23rd of September, the day of the mini-budget, this line heads sharply upwards. That's the sign of people losing confidence in this market, trying to sell these bonds as quickly as they can. To the point where on the 28th, the Bank of England feels it has to intervene to try and bring this graph back down and return order to the market. Now, that works for a while, but over October, this line starts heading back up again, a sign that fear is returning to the market, to the point where the Bank of England has had to intervene once more.
The mini-budget has directly caused this disruption in the gilt markets. And the reason for that is because of these unfunded tax cuts. You can look around at other government bond markets around the world, and they haven't moved to this degree.
The Chancellor has only said that he wants to get debt falling relative to the economy in the medium term. And a report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies today highlights how hard this will be. Unless he U-turns on tax cuts, the Chancellor will need to cut spending by £60 billion in 5 years' time. As an example, that might mean saving £13 billion by only increasing working age benefits in line with earnings, not inflation, for 2 years, £14 billion by limiting investment to 2% of national income, and £35 billion by cutting 15% off all departments except health and defence.
One of the problems the government faces is we've had a decade and more of really tight spending settlements. We're still spending less on a lot of public services than we were just over a decade ago. So we're not going into a new period with much fat to trim.
Kwasi Kwarteng says that tax cuts will boost the economy and make such savings unnecessary. And he's brought forward the date when he'll explain his plan in full to October the 31st. But will it be enough to calm the markets which are already badly shaken? Ben King, BBC News.
Well, the UK's unemployment rate has dropped to its lowest level for almost 50 years. According to the Office for National Statistics, between June and August, the unemployment rate fell to 5.3%. That's the lowest quarterly rate since February 1974. This is partly due to an increase in the number of people classed as economically inactive. That's people who aren't ready to start work within a fortnight and haven't been looking for a job during the last month. It's estimated that is around 9 million working-age adults. That's 1 in 5. But the squeeze on pay remains, with rises in regular wages failing to keep up with the rising cost of living. Ramzan Karmali has been looking at the numbers.
As harvest comes to an end, activity at this Warwickshire farm is heating up. These onion pickers are working hard. This farm employs 750 seasonal workers each year. But this season, farmer Derek Wilkinson has struggled to fill his vacancies. And as a result, he's not had the harvest he'd hoped for.
We were 30–40% short of people in May, and that resulted in us losing some of our asparagus crop and also some of our spring onions, which actually cost us as a business £250,000.
If you can't get the workers from abroad, what does that mean for your business?
If government don't listen and don't give us the people, we will see a massive contraction of our UK horticultural industry, because people simply won't risk growing these crops unless they know they've got labour to harvest them. So the production will move overseas.
Farms like this one rely heavily on seasonal workers. The truth is, most of them are from abroad, but without them here, food like this could go to waste. Inna has come from Ukraine. Her pay, like her colleagues, is higher than the national living wage of £9.50 an hour. This isn't the first year she's come here, and she's keen to return.
Salary is in our country is a little low, so it's a big opportunity to come here and collect money, studying, for living, for buy a house, for buy an apartment.
The problem of there not being enough workers in the economy is an ongoing one, with vacancies remaining close to historical highs at over 1.2 million. Additionally, the economically inactivity rate, that's those not looking for work or unable to work, rose to 21.7%. And the number who are inactive as a result of being long-term sick hit a record high at almost 2.5 million. Despite all these pressures in the labour market, wages on average aren't keeping up with inflation yet again.
If we look at public sector pay, for example, it was only just above 2% year on year in this latest release. And that, of course, pulls down the overall average. The other thing I think is that there is a lagged effect. So the tight labour market's been with us for a while, but only now is pay growth really starting to respond to that.
The Chancellor insists that the fundamentals of the UK economy remain resilient and that the government's growth plan will lead to higher wages. But businesses like this farm believe that without enough workers, growth will become harder to achieve. Ramzan Karmali, BBC News, Warwickshire.
Well, our business editor Simon Jack joins me now. Simon, how would you analyse what's going on in our economy?
I think that the big word here is growth. That is the government's #1 priority. And talking to businesses that I have, and you saw there in Ramzan's package that a lot of businesses are finding it very hard to recruit staff, so hard, in fact, they're having to turn away new business, so they're certainly not growing their economy. So the labour market and the tightness of it, the difficulty in hiring people, is a big problem on growth. The other one is that interest rates have been rising very significantly, to the extent that the Bank of England had to get involved again this morning to do an emergency bond buying programme to try and calm the markets down. Because after that mini budget, a lot of the financial market says we don't see how the numbers add up. And if interest rates go up, that's bad for refinancing and new borrowers. And it's also very bad for corporations, companies who would like to borrow to invest to grow the economy. So on two fronts, you have impediments to growth, which puts the emphasis now on the Chancellor to come up with some reforms that will mean employing the supply of labour, employing the supply of things like land to build on. A lot of pressure on him, and the OBR will release their estimate of whether these sums add up at the end of October. There'll be an enormous amount of pressure on that, because the Bank of England does not want to be having to get involved in emergency measures in the bond market, which it has done 2 or 3 times in the since the mini budget. So, as I say, markets are looking for some guidance saying, can you make these numbers add up and can businesses grow? That's the government's #1 priority. But at the moment, there are obstacles in that path.
Simon, thank you very much. Well, MPs returned to Westminster today after a break for the party conferences. Let's get the latest from Westminster with our political correspondent Ian Watson. And Ian, as we've heard, a great deal in the government's in-tray.
Yes, indeed, the in-tray is absolutely overflowing, and most of the stuff in it is about as welcome as a big energy bill. Now, as we heard, Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, is bringing forward his economic plan from the end of November to October the 31st. But that announcement has not eased market jitters. Therefore, the content is obviously going to be much more important than the timing. And if the markets remain spooked after his Halloween statement, well, then the political choices for Liz Truss become all the more difficult. If, for example, she decides to increase benefits by less than the current rate of inflation, many of her own MPs are going to oppose that. If she decides she's going to cut back on big projects, on road building, then some of the MPs who were elected on a promise of levelling up their areas are going to hate it, but it may also prevent her from reaching her goal of increasing economic growth. Now, more immediately this afternoon, the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, is going to call on Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, to reverse that mini-budget from last month. I don't think the government's going to do that, but last week at her conference, Liz Truss said she was angry and determined. She may remain angry, but my goodness, her determination is really going to be tested over the next few weeks.
Ian, thank you. Ian Watson reporting there. Long-range attacks by Russia on Ukraine have continued into a second day, with explosions reported in cities including Zaporizhia and Lviv. President Biden and other world leaders are holding a virtual meeting to discuss the widespread Russian attacks, with President Zelensky joining the G7 gathering too. The United Nations says that Russia's latest attacks appear to have targeted civilian infrastructure and could therefore amount to war crimes. Our correspondent Hugo Bechega has the latest from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv.
Ukrainians went underground this morning. Across the country, the air raid sirens went off, a warning of the Russian threat coming from the sky. On people's phones, a message from the emergency service: stay in shelters.
We don't feel safe because we don't know what's coming next. Nevertheless, I hope that what happened yesterday was the scariest thing and that there won't be anything on this scale in the future.
I'm not afraid because there will be victory for Ukraine, Ukrainians, for all our people. I believe in the armed forces, in our president. I believe in everything every one of us is doing in their own place, in every volunteer who brings victory and peace closer.
Russia hit civilian sites across the country yesterday. Tourist places, parks, busy intersections. The attacks were intended to shake the sense of normality felt here in Kyiv and other cities away from the front lines.
This is where a missile struck in Kyiv. A children's playground nearby was partially destroyed, but work was underway to repair the damage. In cities near the fighting, more destruction. Overnight, the southern city of Zaporizhia was attacked again. This block of flats was hit and one person was killed. At around lunchtime, a missile hit Lviv to the west, near the Polish border. Russia's message to Ukraine that no city is safe. Hugo Bechega, BBC News, Kyiv.
The head of the British intelligence agency GCHQ says that Russian forces in Ukraine are exhausted and running out of ammunition. Sir Jeremy Fleming says Ukraine is turning the tide against Russia, but he warned against complacency, saying that Russia still had a very capable military machine. A court in Manchester has been hearing more evidence in the trial of a neonatal nurse accused of murdering 7 babies and attempting to kill 10 others. 32-year-old Lucy Letby is accused of carrying out the offences between 2015 and 2016 at the Countess of Chester Hospital. She has pleaded not guilty. Well, our correspondent Judith Moritz is outside Manchester Crown Court for us now. Judith, tell us what happened this morning.
Well, the prosecution are continuing to lay out the case against Lucy Letby, and this is a case involving 17 babies. Now, we're not identifying them, we're not naming those babies because of reporting restrictions imposed here. So we're referring to them instead by letters in the alphabet, and 17 babies means babies A to Q. Nick Johnson, KC, opening the prosecution, has been going through each case of those babies one by one, and the jury hearing more detail now about the way in which the prosecution allege Lucy Letby attacked them. We heard that 3 of the babies died and 1 had a life-threatening episode within a 2-week period in June 2015. And we've been told about a range of different methods that the prosecution say Lucy Letby carried out these attacks, including injecting air into the babies, which proved fatal, and in some cases injecting insulin. We've also been told that Lucy Letby searched repeatedly online for information about the parents of some of these babies on Facebook, including on one occasion on Christmas Day. And we were given some detail about the case in particular of baby E, one of a set of twins, the twin boy who was in the intensive care section of the hospital. His mum was in the postnatal ward and came to visit him one night, and the jury was told that as she arrived, without realising it, she interrupted Lucy Letby murdering her son. And Lucy Letby packed her off back to the postnatal ward, telling her, "Trust me, I'm a nurse." But as you said at the beginning, the nurse denies all the charges against her, and the case continues.
Thank you very much, Judith. The first funeral of one of the victims of an explosion at a service station in County Donegal has been held this morning. The funeral mass for 24-year-old Jessica Gallagher took place at St Michael's Church in Creasler. 10 people were killed in Friday's explosion. Police continue to investigate the cause of the blast, but have said it appears to have been a tragic accident. Well, we can speak to our correspondent Charlotte Gallagher, who's in the village for us now. Charlotte.
Hundreds of people were outside that church, Rita, as a hearse carrying Jessica Gallagher arrived, and there was complete silence. People stood remembering this young woman who had travelled the world, Shanghai, Paris, but she'd come home for her dream job. And the priest said she was the jewel in her family, and she left ripples of love everywhere she went. And he said there are no answers as to what happened to Jessica at that petrol station on Friday. And later, the funeral of another victim, Martin McGill, will take place. He was 49, a devoted son, a carer for his elderly mum, and he would do anything for anyone. And it brings it home how small and close-knit this community is, Rita. The simple white church is opposite the pharmacy where Martin had gone that day to pick up a prescription for his mum, and it's next to the primary school where the youngest victim, 5-year-old Shauna Flanagan Garway, attended. This is a community facing its darkest days. People are consumed with grief here, and many will be attending all 10 funerals for those 10 lives lost.
Thank you. Charlotte Gallagher reporting there. The time is 18 minutes past 1, our top story this lunchtime. Bank of England intervenes again to buy more government debt in an attempt to calm investors as the fallout from last month's mini-budget continues. And still to come.
There is the wreck of the Mary Rose. It has come to the surface.
And it's exactly 40 years since Henry VIII's flagship, the Mary Rose, was raised from the bottom of the Solent after over 400 years under the sea.
Coming up on the BBC News Channel, Wales face a playoff that could take them to their first ever Women's World Cup. They play Switzerland tonight, while Scotland could also qualify. They're up against the Republic of Ireland.
Prince and Princess of Wales have recorded a special edition of Radio 1's Newsbeat, speaking about the importance of mental health. The Royals took on the roles as reporters to hear the experiences of 4 guests for World Mental Health Day yesterday. Newsbeat presenter Priya Rai reports.
How are you doing? No, really. How are you doing? It's a simple enough question, but one that can spark a really meaningful conversation. Yesterday was World Mental Health Day, and as part of a special recording, we had two very special Newsbeat reporters to help.
Thanks, Priya. It's great to be here on World Mental Health Day.
I was diagnosed with schizophrenia and emotional unstable personality disorder when I was a teenager, around the ages of 15, 16. A lot of it came from, coming from an African background. Mental health isn't a topic of discussion. It's not something I was aware of or had any knowledge of. And so we are only sort of helped when we're at crisis point, because it's a thing I call over-resilience. We've been made to be so over-resilient that we push away those vulnerabilities and those weaknesses.
The last time we were here was to launch the Heads Together campaign, which was to get people to start opening up and talking about mental health.
Abigail, just maybe you could touch on, I liken a lot of the work we've done on mental health and listening to lots of people talk about is everyone likes a toolbox, particularly for men. A toolbox is quite a useful analogy to kind of use. How much in your work do you see, because you alluded to this fact that big family networks and support networks around people are really important, but a lot of people don't realise what they need until it actually comes along. You can be living one life 1 minute and something massively changes and you realise you don't necessarily have the tools or the experience to be able to tackle that.
So to have, I suppose, in your toolbox, communication would be key. And I think kind of some of the myth busting as well around attachment. We know now through studies that actually any parent who spends a significant amount of time, or any caregiver with the child, will also form similar attachments and have those similar patterns as well.
I'd love to know, and Priya, maybe the listeners also would be interested as well, as knowing how do you look after your own mental health?
That's a big question. I know not every day is going to be roses and sunflowers. I know some days I'm going to have to push against the clouds to see that sun again. And, I know that, when you have a bad day, it doesn't mean it will be a bad week or a bad month. So that's the type of awareness I'm talking about, coming to accept these things.
I'm conscious we might run out of time, and Priya might say this is the worst Newsbeat production by two interviewers she's ever seen.
Do you know what? You can come back. This seat, I've kept it warm. I think you've done a very good job. You can come back. Carry on.
Well, as we said at the start of the special Newsbeat, this is all about having a meaningful conversation on mental health, but it shouldn't stop here.
Yeah, absolutely, because talking about mental health is so important, and it's definitely the first step for us all, is to keep talking, having those conversations and reaching out for help.
And you can watch more from the Prince and Princess of Wales on BBC iPlayer or listen on BBC Sounds. And if you've been affected by any of the issues that they've been discussing or would like to learn more, do visit bbc.co.uk/actionline for more information. The UK's Supreme Court has been hearing arguments on whether Holyrood can set up a referendum on Scottish independence without the agreement of Westminster. Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon wants to hold the vote this time next year, but Downing Street has opposed this. Let's get the latest with our Scotland correspondent Alexandra Mackenzie, who's outside the court in London for us. And what's been said this morning, Alexandra?
Well, legal arguments.
I'm so sorry, we're clearly having a little trouble with that line there. Let's move on. There are calls for the government to expand the eligibility of free school meals to include all children in England from households receiving universal credit. The campaign, called Feed the Future, has the backing of famous chefs, including Tom Kerridge and Jamie Oliver. Ministers say the measure is not the best way to figure out who might need more help. Jamie Oliver argues that extending the scheme would save households money and help to boost the economy.
The reality is, if you speak to the best minds in economics in the country, in the world, they will tell you that if you output healthier kids, you're going to have a more productive, more profitable country, better GDP. And to do that, you have to think in 10 to 20 years, not 3-year cycles. I've been through 6 prime ministers, 13 education secretaries, and none of them have taken seriously, kind of managing child health.
New analysis shows that for the first time, the number of people working in adult social care in England has fallen. Skills for Care, that's the body that monitors the care workforce, says the existing care workforce has dropped by 50,000. Our social affairs editor Alison Holt met one woman who said that getting care for her mother in her final days had been extremely difficult.
It's been raining out there today, it's pouring down.
As the rain drums outside, inside the warmth of family life surrounds Maureen and her daughter Kathy.
I'm still here, Mum.
The 83-year-old, who has liver cancer, is approaching her final hours.
She is quite a strong character, very, very kind, very caring, very considerate.
Maureen and her family want others to understand how the shortage of care workers has turned a difficult time into a nightmare. It started with arguments between councils about who should find and fund support she was entitled to.
Really appalling process of just talking to so many people to try and arrange care and support for her.
Kathy lives miles away, and Maureen ended up in and out of hospital, including being sent home at 3 a.m. to an empty house.
And in fact, I think it was probably the next day that she fell again. Another ambulance called.
Whilst Kathy and the NHS tried to find care workers to visit her at home, Maureen was stuck in hospital.
It's broken. It's completely broken. The social care doesn't exist because why was she then left in hospital for 10 days when they kept saying she's medically fit to be discharged? And that went on and on and on because they couldn't put the care package in place.
Maureen passed away peacefully the day after we filmed with them. The latest data shows the number of people working in care in England has fallen by 50,000 in a year, and there are 165,000 job vacancies. Low pay and 0 hours contracts make it difficult to recruit and keep people. James used to love working in a care home looking after people with dementia, but he was paid the minimum wage. To afford the move to his new rented home, he had to find a better paid job.
Working with the elderly and knowing that I've helped improve some lives somewhere, and knowing that I can't do that now unless I have to make massive personal sacrifices to do that, it's wrong. It shouldn't be that. People shouldn't be having to make sacrifices in their own lives, you know, in terms of, you know, struggling to pay bills, struggling to buy food.
The government says it is putting record extra funding into social care, including money for the recruitment and training of staff. Alison Holt, BBC News.
Now, 40 years ago today, a team of divers, archaeologists and scientists raised a buried gem of Tudor history from the depths of the Solent. After more than 400 years sitting on the seabed, the Mary Rose emerged from the waters. The ship now has her own dedicated museum at the Portsmouth Historic Dockyard, from where John Maguire reports.
There is the wreck of the Mary Rose, this flagship of Henry VIII. The first time we have seen this in 437 years.
Inch by inch, the ship that was the pride of Henry VIII's mighty navy peaked above the waters of the Solent and began to reveal her secrets. The then Prince Charles was present to witness his ancestor's flagship return to the surface.
I believe she's in marvellous condition.
And he was right. The half of the ship and a huge number of artefacts were preserved by centuries, cocooned in mud and silt on the seabed.
So these are some of our Tudor longbows. This is actually one of the ship was listed with 250 longbows. So these are some of them. We've got 130 odd that are complete out of the 250 and fragments of a bit more.
When the ship was first raised, she was kept wet by spraying her timbers. But in recent years, technology has allowed for dry preservation.
Now, those 3 orange squares are on top of the 3 ribs or frames. That was the first thing that was discovered by divers in 1971. It then took a further 11 years of excavation, exploration, examination to bring the Mary Rose to the surface and to see the incredible structure that survives to this day. But that was only part of the story. There's still so much more to discover.
For the next sort of 40 years, we're hoping to uncover even more secrets and maybe even go back on the Solent and get some of the rest that's still down there.
500 souls were lost when the ship sank during a battle with the French in 1545. And the work goes on today to help tell their stories alongside the history of the Mary Rose, providing precious insight into life almost 500 years ago. John Maguire, BBC News, Portsmouth.
Football now, and Scotland's Caroline Weir says it'll be hard to think about the results in the other Women's World Cup qualifiers tonight. They play the Republic of Ireland and need to win, but it might not be enough to qualify automatically. Meanwhile, Wales women's manager Gemma Granger says her side's World Cup qualifying campaign will still be considered a success, even if they don't qualify for next year's tournament. Wales are away to Switzerland in a playoff final tonight. Time for a look at the weather now. Here is Susan Powell with an absolutely glorious autumnal scene behind you.
Afternoon, Rita. It is looking particularly spectacular across many parts of the UK at the moment. The leaves are just starting to get their tint, and there's some pretty generous sunshine out there for many of us currently. We did have a price to pay for that, though, early this morning in terms of temperatures having fallen close to or even slightly below freezing, a frost in parts of Herefordshire and in parts of Oxfordshire. Here are our skies from above now, and you can see some thicker cloud, particularly across Northern Ireland and Scotland, and I think we will see a little more cloud building through the rest of the day across Northern England and into Wales. Weather fronts trying to approach from the northwest, but a lot of dry weather to take us through this afternoon. Best of the sunshine, essentially, I think, the further south and east you sit, and here the top temperatures around 16 degrees. Under the cloud, with some rain by the evening approaching Northern Ireland and Western Scotland, we're looking at highs of 12 to 14. Through the evening and overnight, we see the cloud continuing to drift its way eastwards across the UK. Doesn't look like much, though. We'll get into East Anglia and the southeast. So here we could see a little bit of frost towards the end of the night. Elsewhere, generally milder because of the wind picking up and that cloud insulating things. Temperatures in double figures for Scotland and Northern Ireland, but quite wet overnight and wet first thing on Wednesday. Should brighten quite quickly across the northeast of Scotland. Some rain in the south, lingering through the morning, but out of the way for the afternoon, into drier weather for Northern Ireland for the second half of the day too. Temperatures here very similar to today. England and Wales, overall, I think, with more cloud and some patchy rain for Northern England, the Midlands and Wales in the afternoon. It looks like we could see that rain turning heavier briefly as it heads across the southeast of England tomorrow evening, and then on to Thursday, and we look to the top and tail of the country for our wetter weather. Fairly confident that we will see quite a few showers coming in on the breeze to Scotland and Northern Ireland on Thursday. This area of rain, well, our forecast at the moment is somewhat more iffy. How far north will that rain push? At the moment, it doesn't look like we'll see much further north in the M4 corridor, and we may even not see it look quite this heavy across southern counties of England. So still for many, some decent autumn sunshine on Thursday. And by Friday, it looks like this area of rain will head off towards the continent. We'll keep some showers going to the far north of the UK, and the wind will be a feature for the far north of Scotland, gusting 60 or 70 miles per hour. Could be some fog around first thing across England and Wales on Friday. But actually, well, back to where we are today, essentially. A lot of autumn sunshine as we bring our week to a close, and our temperatures pretty similar to today's as well. Lower end of double figures up into the mid-teens. Rita.
Thank you, Susan. And a reminder now of our top story. The Bank of England intervenes again to buy more government debt in an attempt to calm investors as the fallout from last month's mini-budget continues. And unemployment drops to its lowest level for nearly 50 years. Between June and August, it fell to 3.5%. That is all from BBC News at 1, so it's goodbye from me. And on BBC One, we now join the BBC's news teams where you are. Bye-bye.